The cartographer's stylus was still warm. That was the first thing Fleet Analyst Sorenveth noticed when she lifted it from the desk. Not the shattered display behind it, not the absence of the human assigned to this station, not the fact that 17 restricted star maps had been copied and transmitted in the 11 minutes before the security alert triggered. She noticed the stylus was warm, ceramic composite, rated to hold ambient temperature for roughly 4 minutes before equalizing to the surrounding environment. She had arrived in 6, which meant the human had left after the alert began. She set the stylus down very carefully, the way you set down something you aren't certain is safe to release, and looked at the transmission log still blinking on the cracked display. Destination redacted, authorization forged, method elegant. Her superior would want to know what the humans had stolen. Her instinct, already beginning its quiet alarm somewhere beneath professional composure, wanted to know why the human had made sure someone would find it quickly. The Dominion of Verath had not intended to start a war. This was important context, and also, as it would later be noted in the closed proceedings of 7 separate galactic oversight bodies, almost completely irrelevant to what happened next. What the Dominion had intended was a surgical intelligence advantage, the kind of asymmetric leverage that separates a regional power from a galactic one without the expense of open conflict. The Terran Confederation's navigational archives were, by any reasonable metric, extraordinary. 3 centuries of human exploration had produced the most granular charting of the Orion Cygnus corridor in recorded galactic history. Humans, as it turned out, were exceptionally good at mapping things. They were patient, obsessive, and pathologically unwilling to leave a system uncharted once they'd found it. Even systems with no strategic value, no resources, nothing but cold rock and the particular silence of deep space that apparently held some aesthetic appeal for them. The Dominion wanted those maps. They took them, and 3 days later, something happened to their borders that no one in Verath's leadership structure had an adequate word for. Not because the borders were attacked, because the borders stopped meaning anything. "Tell me again," said Fleet Commander Davin Rez, his secondary eyes half closed in the way that indicated he was restraining the expression that would otherwise cross his face. "How many of our listening posts went silent?" 41. Sorenveth did not look at him when she said it. She was looking at the navigational overlay, at the growing gray zones where their sensor coverage used to be crisp and certain. "In 72 hours. And the humans are not attacking us." He waited. "They're not doing anything," she said. "That's the problem." The mystery began, as most genuinely dangerous mysteries do, with something that looked like nothing. In the first 18 hours after the theft, Dominion Strategic Command had been almost celebratory. The human maps were extraordinary. The analysts confirmed it within hours of decryption. Detailed beyond what the Dominion's own survey corps had achieved in those same regions, annotated with human notation systems that were initially confusing but decoded quickly enough, full of gravitational data, jump point stability ratings, atmospheric surveys, resource classifications going back generations. It was, by any measure, a windfall. The analysts had begun the work of integrating the data into Dominion navigational systems immediately. This was expected. This was planned. What was not planned was the moment, at hour 19, when a patrol vessel using the newly integrated route data entered what the maps identified as a stable corridor near the Thresh boundary and came out 15 degrees off course. Its drive stressed in ways consistent with a gravitational anomaly the pilot had not been warned about. The pilot filed a report. The report was logged. The integration team made a note to review the human annotation system more carefully. Perhaps the symbols indicating stability had been misread. A minor calibration issue, almost certainly. At hour 23, a second patrol reported similar drift. At hour 29, A supply convoy took a route the maps rated as exceptionally clear, and lost 14 hours trying to navigate an unexpected debris field that, according to the human data, should not have been there. "The maps are wrong," said Integration Chief Pollen said, in the tone of a person who has just discovered the expensive thing they purchased doesn't work. "Or," said Sorenveth, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room for this entire briefing, "the maps are right and we're reading them incorrectly." The notation system was fully decoded. Was it? She pulled up the original files. By whom? Pollen said, stared at her. By our linguistics team, standard procedure. The Terran Confederation uses 7 regional notation variants. Some of them use the same symbols for different classifications depending on context markers in adjacent columns. She scrolled to a specific annotation. "This symbol," she said, pointing, "means stable transit corridor in 4 of the 7 variants. In the other 3, it means stable for human vessels." The silence in the room had a particular texture. "What does that distinction mean, practically?" Pollen said, asked, though his voice suggested he was already developing a suspicion. "Humans can tolerate higher gravitational stress than our vessels were engineered to withstand. They build their ships differently. They build themselves differently in some relevant ways." She closed the file. "We've been routing our ships through corridors that humans consider safe for humans, not corridors that are safe in any general sense. We didn't steal a universal star map. We stole a human star map. It's calibrated to them." She thought that would be the worst of it. She was not even close. Vashti Chen had left the stylus warm on purpose. This was a thing Sorenveth would not learn for another 40 hours, which meant she would spend those 40 hours operating under a set of assumptions that were, in their entirely reasonable way, completely wrong. The assumption was, human response to the theft would be official, diplomatic protest, formal demand for return, possibly a military posture shift, standard responses from a standard power experiencing a standard grievance. Vashti Chen was not a diplomat. She was not military. She was a junior cartographer, 26 years old, with 3 years of field survey experience and a particular specialty in what the Confederation's Navigation Corps called contextual encoding, the practice of building navigational data in ways that meant different things to different readers depending on their reference framework. She had been working on the station for 8 months. She had known for 6 of those months that someone was building toward a theft. "The thing people don't understand about maps," she had told her colleague Dren Akafer once, months before any of this began, while they were eating terrible station food at a terrible hour of the night, is that a map is never neutral. A map is always a perspective. It shows you what the cartographer decided to show you, in the way the cartographer decided to show it. Dren had said something non-committal, because it was late and he was tired. "A map can tell the truth," Vashti said, "and still completely mislead you, depending on whether you know how to read it." Dren had not thought about that conversation until much later. Most people wouldn't. By hour 48, the Dominion was experiencing what its logistics commanders were carefully not calling a navigational crisis, because calling it a crisis would require explaining how it had begun. 31 patrol routes were showing inconsistencies, not catastrophic failures, no vessels lost, no collisions, nothing that would register as an attack if you were looking for an attack. Just drift, inefficiency, routes taking longer than projected, jump calculations requiring manual recalculation in the field, fuel expenditure running higher than planned, which cascaded into supply timing issues, which meant patrol vessels were spending more time at resupply points and less time covering their assigned corridors. The gaps in coverage were, by themselves, individually small. Collectively, they were beginning to make the Dominion's border look like something with holes in it. "This isn't possible through map error alone," said Sorenveth, standing in front of the strategic display at hour 50, watching the gray zones expand. Calibration errors would cluster. These are distributed, specifically distributed. Fleet Commander Davinrez studied the display for a long moment. You're saying the errors were designed. I'm saying the distribution pattern is not random. Then the maps were falsified before we acquired them. Vashti had anticipated this conclusion. It was the wrong one. No, Sorenveth said slowly. The maps are real. I've cross-referenced them against independent survey data from the Keth Cooperative Archives. The underlying navigation data is accurate, every single point. She turned to face him. Whatever was done to these maps, it wasn't falsification. The data is true. The way the data interacts with our systems is the problem. That doesn't make sense. No, she agreed, it doesn't. Outside, somewhere in the Thresh corridor that a human cartographer had once annotated with a symbol that meant exactly what she said it meant, and also something else entirely. A Dominion patrol vessel was burning extra fuel, recalculating a route it should have been able to run in its sleep. What Sorenveth had not yet identified was the second layer. This was, in retrospect, the key thing about Vashti Chen's work. It had layers, not in the metaphorical sense that most people use when they mean complicated. In the technical sense, literal layers encoded into the data structure of the maps themselves, invisible unless you knew to look for them, and specifically what to look for. The outer layer was the calibration issue, the human-specific notations that Dominion systems were reading correctly in terms of syntax, but incorrectly in terms of meaning. This layer created the navigational drift. This was the obvious problem, the one that looked like the problem. The second layer was quieter. Humans who study navigation for long enough develop a particular relationship with the concept of asterisk-negative space, the places on a map where nothing is marked, and what that absence communicates. Vashti had written her thesis on it, 300 pages on the semiotics of cartographic omission. Her committee had called it impressive and impractical and given her the highest possible marks. In the maps that had been stolen, there were 17 regions marked with no annotation at all. No resources, no hazards, no stability ratings. In the Dominion reading of the data, these regions had been flagged as survey gaps, areas the humans simply hadn't fully documented yet. They were not survey gaps. They were jump relay positions. The Terran Confederation's long-range communication network ran on a system of distributed relay nodes, small, low-signature stations anchored at specific gravitational nexus points throughout the Orion Cygnus corridor. These nodes were the reason Confederation vessels could maintain contact across vast distances without the power expenditure that direct transmission required. They were the Confederation's nervous system. They were invisible on the maps because Vashti had marked them using a system of absence. The blank spaces were not blanks. They were locations. And the pattern they formed, to someone reading the map in the right way, with the right reference framework, was a precise and complete map of the Confederation's communication infrastructure. The Dominion had stolen a document that told anyone who could read it exactly where to strike to disconnect the Confederation from itself. Vashti had made sure they stole it. She gave it to them, said Dren Akafor, in the emergency session that occurred after Sorenveth finally saw asterisk it, the pattern in the blank spaces at hour 61, 3 days after the theft. She let them take it. Not let, Sorenveth said. Her voice was doing something unusual. Arranged. There's a difference. She had been staring at the display for 4 minutes without speaking. And we've been sending patrol vessels away from those relay points. Our coverage gaps are perfectly sized and placed to leave every single one of those nodes accessible. The room understood this slowly, in stages, the way you understand something that takes a moment for the full shape to become clear. She used our own response to move our ships, Davinrez said. She used our misreading of her maps to move our ships, Sorenveth corrected. She didn't need to touch our vessels. She just needed us to use the data incorrectly, which we did, predictably, because the calibration errors were the obvious problem and we focused on them. A pause. And while we were focused on the obvious problem, the Confederation has been moving. Davanrez turned to the tactical display, saw it immediately once he knew to look. How long have they been repositioning? Based on the timing, Sorenveth said, since before we took the maps. Vashti was on a transport by the time Sorenveth found the second layer. She was eating a meal she hadn't particularly earned and watching stars pass and thinking about layers. The third layer was the one she hadn't told anyone about yet. Not her superiors, not the intelligence officers who had very carefully not asked her directly what she had done, not Dren, who had looked at her across the briefing table with an expression that mixed admiration and alarm in roughly equal proportions. The third layer was personal, or it had started as personal. It had become something else when she'd realized how far the Dominion was willing to go, what the intelligence building in the station's security archives actually suggested about their intentions for the Confederation's outer settlements. She had discovered, 8 months ago, while reviewing the station's apparently routine maintenance logs, a sub-channel communication that predated her arrival by 2 years. The Dominion's approach to the theft had not been improvised. It had been planned, patiently, over years, using access routes that suggested internal cooperation from someone within Confederation infrastructure. Someone had let them in, long before Vashti arrived, and whoever it was had known the map's location, security protocols, and this was the part that had kept her awake more nights than she would have preferred, the precise nature of the Confederation's outer settlement support infrastructure. The settlements the Dominion's documents, when she'd eventually managed to access them, described as assimilation candidates. The third layer of the map was not navigational. It was a record, encoded in the same system of annotated absence that she'd used for the relay node positions, spread across hundreds of data points that would look meaningless to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years learning to read cartographic semiotics at the level that produces a 300-page thesis. It was a complete record of what she'd found, the subagent, the timeline, the plans. It was addressed to the Confederation's intelligence apparatus, encoded in a format they would recognize. It was also addressed, in a different format on a different layer, to every independent observer species with representation in galactic oversight. And it was timestamped to begin decrypting automatically, without any further action from Vashti, at precisely 72 hours after transmission, which was 4 minutes from now. She watched the stars and waited. What arrived in the communications buffers of 11 separate galactic oversight bodies simultaneously was not a declaration. It was not a protest, or a demand, or a formal grievance. It was a document, a map technically, annotated in a notation system that was explained in a 12-page guide attached to the transmission, patient and precise, because Vashti had understood that her audience would need the guide. What the map showed, layer by layer as the decryption moved through its stages, was the following. The Dominion's plan in full, the theft, the intent, the target, the settlements. The Dominion's internal agent inside Confederation infrastructure, named, evidenced, timestamped. The navigational disruption already underway in Dominion space, still ongoing, caused by no one, caused by the Dominion's own systems faithfully executing human cartographic data that was perfectly true and specifically calibrated. And in the final layer, something no one had expected, the Confederation's counterpositioning already complete, every vessel in place, every relay node protected, not because intelligence had scrambled after the theft was discovered, because the response had been prepared before the theft occurred, because the map had been prepared before the theft occurred. She knew they were coming, said Sorenveth, reading the transmission in her office at hour 73, the precise clinical surface of her voice doing something it was not designed to do. She knew 2 years before they moved. She spent 2 years building a document that would do 6 separate things simultaneously if they stole it. The navigation errors to disrupt our operations. The relay map in the negative space to show us what we were supposed to think we'd found. The blank zones to reposition our patrols away from Confederation assets. The embedded record to expose our agent. The time transmission to every oversight body to occur precisely when our vessels were maximally displaced from normal operating positions. A pause, longer than was strictly professional, and the warm stylus, to make sure we came quickly, to make sure the clock started on time. Fleet Commander Davinrez had not spoken in several minutes. When he did, his voice had a quality to it that Sorenveth would remember for a long time. How old did you say the cartographer was? 26. Another silence. What does the Confederation want? He asked. They haven't said. Sorenveth was still staring at the decrypted document. I don't think they're going to. I think the oversight bodies will handle the settlement question and the agent question and the intent question. The Confederation didn't need to threaten us. She scrolled to the final page of the map. There was almost nothing there. Just coordinates and a single line of text in standard trade language. She read it twice before she said it aloud. We already know the way home. The question is whether you do. The trials took 8 months, not the kind of trials that involve weapons, the other kind, which are in some ways harder to survive. The Dominion's internal agent was named and tried under its own law, which was thorough and merciless, and public enough to constitute its own kind of consequence. The settlement expansion plans were formally withdrawn under the terms brokered by Galactic oversight. 3 Dominion officials resigned. 2 more were reassigned to positions from which they would never regain meaningful authority. Sorenveth filed her final report on the incident from a desk that was not her original desk, in an office with a window, which she had not had before. The report was thorough and honest and became required reading in 2 separate intelligence training programs, because it was one of the most detailed accounts available of how an operation could fail completely, while every individual step appeared to succeed. She wrote, in the conclusion, a sentence that her trainees would later pull out and argue about. The error was not taking the maps. The error was assuming that what we had taken was something they did not wish to give us. Dren Akafer found Vashti sitting in the Survey Corps common room 2 days after the final oversight verdict, eating again. She seemed to eat constantly now, in the way of someone who had not been eating enough for a long time, reading something on a pad he couldn't see from the doorway. He came in and sat across from her without asking. "Are you done?" he asked. "With eating, no, with the rest of it mostly." She turned the pad over. "There's a survey mission to the Calder Shelf. Deep frontier work, 18 months, 6-person team. They need someone who specializes in contextual encoding." "Of course they do." He looked at her for a moment. "Vash, you were 23 when you figured out what they were planning." 24. My birthday was the week after. "You didn't tell anyone for 2 years." "I needed it to work." She said this without particular emotion, which was its own kind of emotion. If I'd reported it immediately, they would have patched the access route and tried again later, with a better plan and a more careful agent and none of the evidence on record. I needed them to commit fully. I needed them to take the map. She paused. I needed to be ready before they moved. 2 years. It's not that long. It is, Dren said quietly, and you know it is. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, stars that she could name, chart, and annotate by gravitational characteristic in her sleep continued their patient indifference. "The settlements," she said, "the ones in the assimilation documents, 4 of them have people I grew up with, went to school with. There's a girl I shared a room with for 2 years in the Survey Academy who runs supply logistics for Kepler Station." She picked up the pad again. "I needed it to work. so I waited until it would work. Dren didn't say anything for a while. The Calder mission, he said finally. Is it real, or are you already doing something else? Vashti looked at him with an expression he recognized from 8 months of working with her, the one that meant she was deciding how much to say. It's real, she said. I'm not always running a plan, Dren. I know, he said. He didn't entirely believe it, and she knew he didn't, and neither of them mentioned this, which was its own kind of communication. Sarenveth was called, 14 months after the incident, to consult on a training program being developed for the new Dominion Confederation Intelligence Cooperation Framework, one of the stranger and more optimistic institutional developments to emerge from the aftermath. Her contribution was a 2-day seminar on the concept she had named, in her report, Calibrated Misreading, the practice of creating information systems that produce useful results for the intended reader and systematically misleading results for any other reader, without containing any false information. She was good at explaining it. She was not certain she fully understood it, which was a feeling she had not often experienced in her career and found more interesting than she expected. Her trainees asked many questions. The most common one in various forms was, how do you defend against this? Sarenveth gave the same answer every time. Don't, she said, not directly. You cannot defend against a trap you cannot see, and you cannot see this trap because there is nothing to see. The information is true. The system is accurate. The vulnerability is in you, in your assumptions about why information is shared, who it serves, and what it is designed to do. She would look at them then, this room of careful, intelligent, well-trained analysts, and feel something she could not have named precisely. The Terran cartographer was 24 years old. She worked alone. She had no support structure for what she did, no authorization, no safety net. She spent 2 years preparing a document that had to work correctly on 6 different levels simultaneously, deployed against an intelligence apparatus with infinitely greater resources, and it worked because she understood something very simple. What? A trainee asked once. Just the one word, impatient and genuine. She understood, Sarenveth said, that a map is not what you find. A map is what the cartographer wanted you to find, and she was a better cartographer than we were readers. The thing about the stars is that they don't care. Vashti understood this at a level that was more physiological than philosophical. She had spent enough time in the deep survey work, the long quiet stretches where you are alone with instruments and data, and the particular silence that has no human scale to measure it against, to have stopped finding the indifference of space either comforting or threatening. It was simply the condition. You were small. The distances were incomprehensible. The systems you charted would outlast every civilization that had ever mapped them. And still you mapped them. Every human who had ever come out here mapped them. Obsessively, patiently, annotating the same gravitational anomalies with the same symbols generation after generation, building a body of knowledge that accumulated not because any individual chart was world-changing, but because the whole, over centuries, became something that the galaxy had found it could not replicate and had therefore tried to take. She thought about this on the transport to Calder, watching the stars she knew give way to stars she would need to learn. The Dominion had taken the maps because they wanted what the maps represented, not just navigational data, but the 3 centuries of accumulated human willingness to go out into the uncatalogued dark and be precise about what they found there. The patience of it, the obsessive, slightly unreasonable dedication to correctness in conditions where correctness was hard. They had taken the maps, and the maps had done what Vashti designed them to do. But here was the thing that Sarenveth's report had not quite reached, that her trainees' questions had circled without landing on, that the Galactic oversight proceedings had acknowledged in passing without fully examining. Vashti had not destroyed anything. The Dominion's patrol routes were disrupted, yes, and then were corrected, because Vashti had included, in the technical appendix of the oversight transmission, a complete guide to reading the human notation system correctly. All 7 regional variants. Every contextual marker. Enough to make the maps function perfectly for any reader willing to use the guide. She had given them back the maps, in a form they could use. After everything. Why, Dren had asked, when he'd found this in the document. Because we'll need them to know how to navigate, Vashti had said. Eventually. That's very optimistic, given. It's cartographic, she said, which was her word for the particular kind of long-view thinking that looked like optimism from the outside and felt, from the inside, like arithmetic. You chart the territory accurately. You plan for the possibility that the reader will eventually learn to read. You build for that, even if they're not ready yet. She charted. She planned. She built for futures she might not see, in the way that people do when they have spent enough time in the dark to understand that the map survives the cartographer. The Calder shelf was extraordinary. Cold, distant, full of systems that had never been formally recorded, gravitational phenomena that existing models only partially explained. A kind of raw astronomical complexity that made Vashti's instruments work harder and her annotations grow more careful and specific with every pass. She spent 18 months there. She documented everything. She developed 2 new notation conventions for phenomena the existing 7 regional variants didn't have symbols for, and sent them back to the Corps for review with the careful hope that they'd be adopted before the next surveyor came this way. Her maps were accurate, precise, calibrated as all her maps were to the reader they were designed for. She annotated carefully what was safe for human vessels, and marked it as such. She left certain regions blank, in a pattern she would later explain in a document attached to the archive submission, patient and precise, because she understood that her audience would need the guide. Somewhere in the files of a Dominion intelligence archive, Sorenveth's report gathered the quiet significance that useful documents accumulate when they tell an uncomfortable truth precisely enough to remain true indefinitely. Its final line, added in the last revision late, after she had reread everything 3 times, was not part of the formal conclusion. It was a note she had written to herself, and then decided to leave in because removing it felt dishonest. We came to understand, too late and then just in time, that we were not dealing with a civilization that wanted to defeat us. We were dealing with a civilization that had learned to think in centuries, because centuries were what the distances required. They are not the strongest species in the explored galaxy. They are not the most technologically advanced. They are not the most numerous or the most territorially dominant or the most feared in any of the conventional senses. They are the species that will chart your home system accurately and file the documentation correctly even after you have given them every reason not to. They will build the road before they need it. They will write the guide for the enemy who stole their maps. They will wait 2 years in silence to make the trap work, and the trap will cost them those 2 years, and they will decide the cost is worth it, and they will be right. The cartographer was 24 years old. She had no authority and no backup and no certainty the plan would work. She built the map anyway. This is the thing I do not know how to report in a format that administrative systems are designed to process. The humans are not dangerous because of what they have. They are dangerous because of what they are willing to do with what they have, for as long as it takes, at whatever cost it requires, without guarantee of success, without certainty of survival, because somewhere in the fundamental architecture of how they experience existence, the uncharted territory is always worth the crossing. We took their maps. They gave us better ones. I don't know what to do with that. She filed the report. She went home. The stars, indifferent and patient and precisely where the maps said they would be, continued their long work of being exactly what they were, waiting, as they had always waited, for someone willing to come out far enough to see them clearly and careful enough